This video is going to talk about some of the different types and forms of questions that you might encounter when doing a WeBWorK assignment or quiz. So these are types of problems that you might see in either one of those contexts. So if you are interested in seeing how to appropriately enter your answers for those types of questions, this is the video for you. So let's go ahead and look at, again, our fake student here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and let's go back to that example problem set, WeBWorK example questions not graded. So here what I've done is I've reassigned this to this student so that it's a nice fresh assignment. Notice that they have not used any attempts here. They have a status of 0% on all of the questions. It's a brand new assignment for them. And here are the attempts remaining for each of those questions. If you're not sure about working through assignments or how to submit them, please see the previous video talking about how to navigate and submit WeBWorK assignments. Here we're just going to focus on the different types of problems. So each one of these problems, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, focuses on a different type or form of problem you might see in a WeBWorK assignment or quiz. Now these kind of start from the most basic to the most common, or the kind where entering your answer has a couple different ways of working. So we'll start kind of from the most simple to the most involved, I guess is the right word. So one type of question you might run into is just your standard multiple choice question. So just like a multiple choice test on paper, these are questions where there's one best answer. And so when you're dealing with a multiple choice question, you're just going to pick your answer by selecting the radio button next to the option that you want to pick. Now for these, I have a couple examples in this example question set. If you want to, you can go through them on your own. I'm just going to do one or two at a time just for demonstration's sake. For example, this first one, part A, which of the following statements is true? Well, if I read through these questions, or these options, it looks like the only one that's true is going to be this one here, 5 minus 5 is 0. So I want option D. So I can either click the option itself or I can click the radio button. And of course I can change it as I change my mind, if I change my mind or do something else with the calculation. But essentially it's just like your multiple choice question on regular paper. So like I said, I'll just do parts of these at a time, just for demonstration's sake. So that one was part D. So that's your standard multiple choice question. Another type of question you might encounter, as demonstrated here in problem 2, are questions where there are multiple answers, or what I like to call select all that apply questions. So these are questions where there might be one or more correct answers. And again, kind of like you would on paper, these are check boxes, not radio buttons, so I am able to check multiple of these at a time, and I can uncheck them if I don't want to select them. So just as an example here, we want to select all of the following numbers that are integers. So which of these are integers? Well, B, -5, that's an integer, 0 is an integer, 3 is an integer, and if I accidentally click, say, 4.5, which is not an integer, I can just click that box again, get rid of that. Now there might be cases where select all that apply involves one or more. There also might be cases where select all that apply is just a single correct answer. So if we look at this last one here, select all of the following numbers that are divisors of 24. Well, none of these are divisors of 24, so the correct answer, even though I can select multiple ones, is just the last answer there, E. And this will show you what answers you selected for each of those multiple option questions. All right, problem 3 demonstrates a third type of problem you might run into, which is one where you have a drop-down menu or multiple drop-down menus that you need to select your answer from. So typically with these drop-down menu questions, the default answer in the drop-down menu, or the default option, is a question mark. And if you want to see the other options, you can just click on the drop-down menu itself. So for example, this first one, part A, which of the following is the correct translation of the mathematical phrase, this thing here? So if I want to see my options, x is blank 5, I can click on this drop-down menu and see the options that I could select. So this is the same thing as x is less than 5. So here I'm going to just select less than, click on it, and it will put that as my answer. Now one thing you want to be careful of is using like your arrow keys or your scroll button on your mouse, because that might change your answer here unless you click out of the box then you can probably hear me tapping on my keys, then it doesn't change. But just, it's a good idea to double check your answers when you're using drop-down menus like this, just in case you accidentally press an arrow key and it changes without you noticing. So it's a good idea to check that, and then click out of the box so you can see that one's highlighted a little bit more boldly. Click out of the box and it's no longer active. So there's your drop-down menu. The fourth question demonstrates another type of problem you might run into. This is probably the least common or least frequent type of problem you might see, but you might see it, so it's worth noting anyway. So there might be cases where a question requires a word or a phrase that you need to type in your answer box. So one thing to note about these types of questions, we'll get to numeric answers in a second, but here these are usually questions that involve a word or a phrase. And the thing about these questions is to make sure you enter your word or phrase exactly as specified. So a lot of times these questions are going to tell you exactly what options you have to enter and how to enter them. So in this question, we're saying for each of the following statements, enter one of the following without quotes, such that the statements are true. So these look like they're also relational inequality type statements, and we can use the phrase less than, greater than, or equal to. So we need to type those in to make these statements true. So let's look at this first one. Part A is saying 100 is blank 99. Well, 100 is obviously greater than 99, so that's the option I want to pick. Now, it's a good practice to match exactly the options that WeBWorK gives you. So this is in all caps, and I want to enter it without quotes. So I'm going to enter this as capital greater space than without the quotes, because that looks like the answer that WeBWorK will recognize. For this second one here, or negative 44 is blank negative 55. Well, negative 44 is greater than negative 55, just like 100 is greater than 99. But let's see what happens if I don't put that space in there. So with these types of questions, what you might run into is you might run into a case where if you enter something that WeBWorK does not know in this context of this question, it will give you some sort of error message. So this is telling me that greater than without that space is not defined in this context. And that's usually an indication to go back and just make sure that you entered your answer in the form that WeBWorK wants. Now, if you're having trouble with these questions, like maybe you use up 1 or 2 attempts and you're still not getting it right, but you think your answer is right, maybe just double check the casing, make sure you're not using quotes if it says enter without quotes, that kind of thing. So there, I put the space in, and now we're fine. All right, and then finally here, question 5. I want to spend a little bit more time on this because these are the most common types of questions you're going to run into as far as what you need to enter. So these types of questions require a number or a calculation as your answer. Now these look kind of like the problems on the previous question here where there's an entry box, but now it's asking for a number or a formula or a calculation rather than a phrase or a word. Now sometimes with these types of questions it can be pretty obvious what you need to enter. So let's look at these first 3 here. So A is 50 plus 32. Well, 50 plus 32 is just 82, so I can just enter 82 there. 23 plus 14.44, not too complicated, that's 37.44. And this last one here is 3 minus 9.1234, which gives me a negative number, negative 6.1234. So these types of questions aren't that complicated as far as what you need to enter, but it is always worth noting anything involving rounding or how many decimal places the question wants. So for this first part, it's asking us to round it to at least 3 decimals in your answers if necessary. Now this if necessary is important because sometimes people get confused with that. If your answer is an integer like this first one, or a case where there aren't 3 decimals that are non-zero behind the decimal space, you don't have to enter like here 0.000. It says if necessary, just in case you have more than 3 decimal places behind the decimal and you need to do some sort of rounding. Now in this part, part C, I could get away in this case with this, negative 6.123, because that is rounding to at least 3 decimal places. But if I keep more decimals than it asks, that's fine as well. So if this had like 18 decimals behind it here, I could enter all of those as long as they're all, of course, correct. And I would still be okay, because this is saying I need to round to at least 3 decimals. So if you don't like to round, or you don't want to round at all, that's fine. I always recommend more decimal places than it asks for, just to be safe, just so that you're not accidentally messing up that rounding on the last decimal. It's always a good idea to enter as many decimals as you can, especially if it doesn't specify. Now, every once in a while you're going to run into a question that doesn't specify the number of decimal places at once. The more the better. I always recommend at least 5 if you can get to that level of accuracy. Okay, now every once in a while you might run into questions where your answer might involve a little bit more complicated work, such as maybe multiple operations like adding and subtracting and dividing, or you might need to do like a square root of something, or you might need to adjust your order of operations a little bit, that kind of thing. Now, one nice thing about WeBWorK is you can use it as a calculator. In other words, WeBWorK recognizes answers entered as equations. So let's look at this second one here as an example. So here we have 3 values of x. X sub 1 is 5, x sub 2 is 2, x sub 3 is negative 13, and we want to compute this thing. So the sum of those values, let me zoom in here a little bit so that's easier to see, the sum of those 3 values over n, where n is 3. Now if you're taking Stat 205 or 213, you'll learn about this quantity a little bit. It's the mean, it's the average, so you'll see that later. But this is the calculation I want to do. Alright, so for this question, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to enter it as just a block of calculations. So I'm going to take my 5 plus 2 plus negative 13, and I want to divide that by n, where n is 3. So let me just enter it like that. Now what I'm going to do, let me zoom back out here, is I'm going to enter this as my answer to this problem. So I'm not done with the problem yet, but I'm going to submit my answers and see what WeBWorK does with this. Okay, so all of those easy to enter values are fine, but this one is not looking right. So why is this wrong? Well, when you're dealing with using WeBWorK as a calculator, so something like this or something involving another formula like that, it is important to double check to make sure that WeBWorK is reading your calculation the way that you want it read. In other words, you might need to do a little bit of adjustment, making sure that it is doing the precise specifics of your calculation that you want. And the easiest way to determine if it is or not is to press this button next to the answer box. So this button here with this little grid of 9 dots. If I press on this, what it's going to do is it's going to give me a preview of how WeBWorK reads my input. Now this isn't that big of a deal for these because these are just numbers. It's going to read them as just the plain numbers. But whenever you're entering an equation or a formula or something like that, it's a good idea to use this feature because you can see exactly what WeBWorK is reading. Now this is obviously, let me move this, this is obviously not what we wanted here. We wanted these to be added, and that is a negative 13, so I'm going to get rid of that plus minus there, and then divided by 3. So now I can see that this matches the form of this formula here, and if I click Submit Answers again, this should be marked as correct. So here's how WeBWorK read it, and it also does the calculation for you here. So I could have used my calculator and gotten a negative 2. I could have entered negative 2 here instead. That's perfectly fine. But if I didn't want to do that, or if it's too complicated to do that and you want to just put it as a formula, this is the way to do it. It's just be very careful with those orders of operation. Double check the form of your answer to make sure WeBWorK's reading it the way you want it to be read. Now this second part here is the same sort of idea. If these questions are posted for you, maybe try that one out and see how that one works as well. Alright, now one other feature I want to mention about that little button is something that can help you enter expressions that might be a little bit more complicated than just addition, subtraction, that kind of thing. So if you need to enter an expression with a square root or a logarithm or a trig function or something like that, this button can also help you out with that. So let's look at part A of this last example here. So our function f of x is the square root of x, and we want to find f of 10x plus 6 when x is equal to 3. So this function involves a square root. I might not know how to enter the operation square root into WeBWorK. So what I can do is I can click in my entry box here, click on this button, and this is actually called the equation editor. And so what this allows me to do is it allows me to see how different types of operations might be entered. So we've got trig functions there, logarithms, interval notation, things like that. So square root is under exponents here. So I want to enter a square root in this problem, so I can just click on that. And it not only tells me like how to actually type square root in here if I ever just want to type it and not use the equation editor, but it basically prints out the square root and it's saying, okay, well, what are you taking the square root of? So here I'm taking the square root of 10x plus 6 when x equals 3. So what that means is under the square root here is going to be 10 times x. X is 3, so I'm going to do a little asterisk there, 3, sorry, plus 6. Now it's always a good idea just to make sure, as far as order of operations go, that you're doing exactly what you want to do with these calculations. So just to be safe, I'm going to put another pair of parentheses, or another set of parentheses rather, around that 10 times 3, just so WeBWorK is clear that I want that multiplication first, 30, then plus 6, all under the square root. And so I can X out of there, and if I want to, before I submit my answers, I can preview them and just see, make sure that this is correct. Well, WeBWorK calculates this as 6, so that's 30, 10 times 3 is 30 plus 6, 36. Square root of 36 is 6, so that looks like it should be counted as correct. And if I click Submit Answers here, I should be fine there. And you can also combine multiples of these as well if you need to. So if you've got square root of the natural log of x, for example, you can put in here square root, and then under logarithms, natural log, in this case of x, where x is 1. You can preview that if you want to. Well, the natural log of 1 is 0, square root of 0 is 0, so that looks like it should be okay. And then submit your answers. So it's always a good idea to check out that equation editor, even if it's just for the sake of the preview of an expression or an equation that you're using, and also to double check and see how many decimal places you need to enter at minimum in order for the question to be counted as correct.